Amritsar, in the northwest Indian state of Punjab, is today a thriving hub and home to a major Sikh pilgrimage site, the Golden Temple. But 100 years ago, it was the scene of a terrible atrocity. In April 1919, riots broke out in the city. 5 Europeans and many more Indians were killed. British colonial authorities declared martial law and banned public meetings. Brigadier General R.H. Dyer was brought in to quell unrest in the city. What exactly happened on the 13th of April 1919 is still disputed 100 years on. We know that a crowd of 15 to 20,000 civilians, Hindus, Muslims and Sikhs, were gathered at Jallianwala Bagh, a public garden. It was the day of a religious holiday which attracted thousands to the gardens. But there was also a protest against the British regime. General Dyer ordered his troops to open fire. The bullet holes are still present at the memorial. The exact death toll is unknown, but hundreds were killed and many, many more injured. Winston Churchill, War Secretary at the time, described the killings as monstrous the following year. On a state visit in 1997, the Queen called the massacre distressing. More recently, David Cameron described it as deeply shameful. A century on, the question is whether the British should formally apologise. Theresa May worded her view carefully in the Commons this week.
The tragedy of Jallianwala Bagh in 1919 is a shameful scar on British Indian history. We deeply regret what happened and the suffering caused.
For many, that's simply not enough. And they're demanding an unqualified apology for what happened at Amritsar 100 years ago. It's far from clear whether they'll ever get their wish.
Well, with me now are Kim Wagner, who has written a book on the massacre, and Sathnam Sanghera, whose documentary on the topic is airing on Channel 4 tomorrow. Good evening to both of you. First of all, to both of you, though, I mean, how do you see the massacre in the context of the British in India?
Well, I think we have this narrative in Britain where we're always the good guys. You know, we defeated the Nazis, we abolished slavery, empire was a great thing. You can't watch BBC One for longer than 90 minutes without seeing Michael Portillo get off a train and go on about how the British introduced railways to India. But actually, what this massacre tells you is that sometimes we were the bad guys. Sometimes we were the racists. And I think we need to come to terms with that.
What do you think in terms of what we're talking about now and the idea of an apology?
I think I'm sympathetic to the notion of an apology, but I think it's likely to really serve as a gloss. And an apology without any real acknowledgement, I think, is likely to be counterproductive. And the kind of wording we've seen as well is not really reflexive of any deeper understanding, but really just politics.
That question of the understanding, I mean, the idea, you think, then, is an apology about this particular horrific incident simply lets the UK off the hook.
And also the way we've seen it, it's people are quoting Churchill, talking about the massacre as unprecedented and isolated, which is, objectively speaking, inaccurate. I mean, there were many other massacres within the empire.
What do you think about that, Sathnam, that we shouldn't just... An apology is too simple?
I could disagree with Kim completely in that you often hear the case being made that you can't apologise about this because then you'll have to apologise about the Mau Mau, about the concentration camps in South Africa, about the Spice Girls. But actually, you know, we were already in the business of apologising. We've just had the Bloody Sunday inquiry, £200 million spent. It ended with David Cameron sort of apologising. Why don't we do the same with this? And I think the state did very badly with the Jallianwala Bagh massacre. Dyer was exonerated by the Lords. He more or less had a state funeral. You know, the public raised the equivalent of £1.3 million for him afterwards. So it's an open wound.
The idea that there were, of course, Sikhs and Gurkhas in those firing, you know, that's something we never talk about either.
It's a complex story.
Of course, they were under orders, let's just be quite clear.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. But really, this was a moment in which Indians were looking forward towards some kind of independence, dominion status and reforms, if nothing else. But the British, on the other hand, were looking backwards, or really afraid of a replay of the Indian uprising of 1857.
You talk about the fact that, you know, we always say how brilliant the British were at trains and slavery and so forth. Why is empire so rarely taught in schools? Is it just too difficult to talk about it? Empire's all around us. I mean, Glasgow is all around you. It's in the street names, it's everything.
I think we lack a language with which to talk about the empire today, and I think it's desperately needed on the brink of Brexit, that we in Britain, and I'm using the inclusive we, take a long, hard look in the mirror of history, warts and all. And it's not about falling back on this oversimplistic and moralizing balance sheet approach of it either being good or bad, or you can somehow balance it out.
And if you think that of a nation that has done that, you'd say post-war Germany did that. It absolutely looked clear in the face at what happened and owned it.
Absolutely. But also in France, the kind of debates they have about empire are very, very different from what we have in Britain today.
Tell me about France, and of course Italy too, but France particularly.
Well, the process of decolonization was incredibly bloody, and it was fought out in the streets of Paris. But the kind of report we recently saw that Macron had commissioned on repatriation is actually an incredibly progressive and really quite amazing document.
It's interesting because do you think if there was, your suggestion would be that it was an apology and it was made a thing, then we would understand more clearly why we are the way we are in Britain, why we're made up of all these people, South Asian people are here and have every right to be here. That would be better understood.
Absolutely. I think I grew up with another narrative in my life where in Wolverhampton, under the shadow of Enoch Powell, where Black and Asian people were regarded as come here without invitation. If I'd been taught this event, I would have realised we were there. The Sikhs were fighting with the British in the mutiny. You know, they're fighting in 2 world wars. And by way of a reward, some of them were murdered in cold blood in 1919. If I'd had that narrative as a kid, it would have changed the way I see myself and also Britain.
That's interesting because having done this documentary, I read that you have actually changed the way that you regard Britain. Explain to me what that means.
I guess, you know, there's no getting away from the fact that British Empire at this time was an exercise in white supremacy. I was told growing up that the British really respected the Sikhs. They saw them as equal. They saw them as the martial race, as you can see from my physique. But I've discovered, whilst making this Channel 4 documentary, that it's just not true. You know, you had British officers talking about Indians and Sikhs as scum, using the N-word, you know, and Indian servants being fired for just touching their British master.
Don't you think that even just an apology, Jeremy Corbyn has called for an absolute apology, even now would do what I'm saying, would actually raise the issue and perhaps bring it to the fore properly?
If that was the case, I would be fully in support of that. The problem is you can also have an apology without any kind of acknowledgement. And the wording that we've seen from Theresa May, Jeremy Hunt and others certainly does not indicate that there is any acknowledgement of the kind of nuances that Sathnam is talking about.
Thank you both very much indeed.